Dead Sea Scroll fragments were recently revealed to the public for the first time. They contained portions of a text that most Western Christians have never read and were never taught about. Researchers decided to run the entire Book of Enoch through Grok AI, asking it to analyze the text the way a specialist would, but without the filters that centuries of religious and institutional processing had applied. What came back was not what most people expected. It was far more specific. The text most people were never told about. The Book of Enoch is attributed to a figure who appears briefly in Genesis. Enoch, described as the great-grandfather of Noah, is recorded as living for 365 years before Genesis says he was no longer present because God took him. There is no mention of death or burial, only a mysterious departure. This unusual ending made Enoch a fascinating figure for ancient writers who developed traditions around him. The Book of Enoch is a large and complex work that describes Enoch's journeys through the heavens, his encounters with angels and fallen beings, visions of cosmic order and judgment, astronomical teachings, and apocalyptic revelations. Scholars believe it was compiled from earlier writings between roughly 300 and 100 BCE, with some sections possibly originating even earlier. For much of Western history, the text was unavailable. It disappeared from Western libraries and survived mainly through the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which preserved it in the ancient Ge'ez language and considered it part of its scriptural tradition. In 1773, Scottish explorer James Bruce brought 3 complete manuscripts from Ethiopia back to Europe, renewing scholarly interest in the work after centuries of absence. The influence of Enoch is significant. The New Testament letter of Jude directly quotes from it and presents the passage as authoritative. Early Christian writers also referenced it, and the world of Jesus and the first Christians was familiar with the text. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 revealed more than 20 fragments of Enoch in Aramaic and Hebrew, showing that it was among the most widely copied writings at Qumran. Despite its historical importance, the Book of Enoch remains largely unknown to many modern readers. Exploring the text reveals a missing piece of ancient religious history and shows how influential writings can disappear from mainstream awareness while continuing to shape later traditions. What Grok actually is and why it matters here. Grok was developed by Grock AI, Elon Musk's artificial intelligence company, and launched in late 2023. It was designed with a specific orientation toward directness and a willingness to engage with questions that other AI systems tend to avoid or soften. For the purpose of analyzing ancient religious texts, this orientation matters. Centuries of scholarly work on the Book of Enoch have produced genuine insights, but they have also produced layers of cautious qualification that make the material difficult for non-specialists to engage with. Academic papers on the text often require familiarity with the technical vocabulary of ancient Near Eastern studies, Second Temple Judaism, and comparative religion just to follow the argument. For most people, the scholarship is inaccessible, not because it is wrong, but because it is wrapped in a language designed for specialists. Grok's analytical capabilities are relevant here in specific ways. It can work through large bodies of text and identify structural patterns, thematic clusters, and repeated motifs. It can cross-reference material across multiple ancient traditions simultaneously in ways that would take an individual human researcher years to accomplish manually. And it can explain what it finds in plain language that does not require a graduate degree to understand. The democratizing effect of this is significant. The connections between the Book of Enoch and the New Testament, the parallels between Enochic figures and Sumerian traditions, the relationship between the astronomical sections of Enoch and the calendrical practices of the Essenes. These are all things that serious scholars have known and discussed for decades. Grok did not discover them. What it did was make them accessible to anyone willing to ask the question, without the mediation of institutional filters that have historically determined what religious information ordinary people are exposed to. What Grok flagged first? The first major section of the Book of Enoch is known as the Book of the Watchers, covering chapters 1 through 36. This section expands on one of the most mysterious passages in Genesis, where the sons of God see human women, take them as wives, and produce children described as mighty beings of ancient times. Genesis chapter 6 gives only a few verses about this event and leaves many questions unanswered. It does not explain who the sons of God were, why their actions were considered significant, or what became of their offspring. Because of this lack of detail, the passage has been debated by scholars and religious thinkers for centuries. The Book of Enoch provides a much fuller narrative. It describes the sons of God as a group of angels called the Watchers. According to the text, 200 Watchers descended from heaven after seeing human women and desiring them. Their leader, Samjaza, organized the rebellion, and the angels swore an oath together before acting, showing that they understood their decision was forbidden. Their children became the Nephilim, powerful beings who grew violent and destructive. The Watchers also taught humanity knowledge that Enoch presents as forbidden, including metalworking, cosmetics, magical practices, and astrology. After the Nephilim were destroyed, their spirits were said to remain on earth as evil spirits that continued to trouble humanity. The story also has parallels with older Mesopotamian traditions. Ancient Sumerian and Babylonian texts describe the Apkallu, semi-divine beings who brought civilization, knowledge, and skills to humans. Scholars have noted similarities between these traditions, suggesting they may come from older shared ideas about divine beings giving knowledge to humanity and the consequences of that act. The Book of Enoch therefore preserves a tradition that connects biblical mysteries, ancient mythology, and early religious thought in a way that continues to influence discussions today. The Nephilim and where evil spirits came from. The fate of the Nephilim in the Book of Enoch fills a major gap left open by the canonical Bible. In Genesis, the Nephilim appear briefly before the flood story begins and then vanish from the narrative. The text does not explain what happened to them or how their existence connects to later ideas about evil spirits and demons. The Book of Enoch provides a detailed explanation. It describes the Nephilim as powerful beings born from the union between the Watchers, fallen angels, and human women. According to the text, the Nephilim consumed the earth's resources, became violent, and brought destruction upon humanity. When they were destroyed, their spirits did not disappear. Instead, Enoch describes them as disembodied spirits that remained on earth, causing suffering, temptation, and corruption. These spirits are presented as the origin of demonic forces. This idea is important because the New Testament contains many accounts of Jesus and his followers confronting demons and unclean spirits, yet the canonical Old Testament gives little explanation for their origin. The Book of Enoch provides a background story that was known in the religious environment of the Second Temple period and helps explain ideas that later appear in early Christianity. Grok's analysis also identified similarities between the Nephilim story and other ancient traditions. Greek mythology includes the Titans, powerful beings who challenged divine authority and were eventually punished. Mesopotamian traditions describe semi-divine figures who brought knowledge and influence to humanity but were connected with disruption and consequences. These similarities do not prove that the events described in these stories occurred. However, they reveal a shared ancient pattern: powerful beings crossing boundaries, changing the human world, and causing consequences. The Nephilim tradition reflects one of humanity's oldest recurring themes: the danger of knowledge, power, and beings who exceed their intended limits. The fallen angels and a passage nobody could explain. The Book of Enoch describes the 200 Watchers descending from heaven to Mount Hermon. The text names several of these beings individually, including Samjaza as their leader, along with Azazel, Armaros, Barakijal, Kokabel, and others. Each watcher is connected with specific forms of knowledge that they introduce to humanity. Among them, Azazel receives special attention. Enoch credits him with teaching humans the creation of weapons such as swords, shields, and breastplates, which transform the nature of conflict and warfare. He is also associated with teaching the use of metals for decoration and cosmetics, which the text presents as part of humanity's moral corruption. At the conclusion of the Watcher's narrative, Azazel is judged, bound, and imprisoned in darkness until the final judgment. Grock's analysis highlighted a connection between Azazel and a difficult passage in the Hebrew Bible. In Leviticus chapter 16, the ritual of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, involves 2 goats. One goat is sacrificed, while the other carries the symbolic sins of the community and is sent into the wilderness. The destination is described with the Hebrew term La Azazel, a phrase that has caused debate among translators. Some interpret it as a place, others as a concept meaning removal or sending away. The Book of Enoch provides another possible context by presenting Azazel as a specific fallen angel responsible for introducing corruption and forbidden knowledge. Within this framework, sending the goat to Azazel represents symbolically returning humanity's accumulated wrongdoing to the being associated with its origin. This interpretation is not the only view among scholars, but the Enochic tradition offers a historical background that helps explain why the name Azazel appears in such an unusual ritual. It shows how ancient texts interacted with one another, and how traditions outside the modern biblical canon influenced the way early communities understood difficult passages. The Astronomy. Chapters 72 through 82 of the Book of Enoch are known as the Astronomical Book, or the Book of the Luminaries. This section is one of the oldest parts of the text and differs greatly from the stories of angels, judgment, and visions found elsewhere in Enoch. The Astronomical Book focuses on the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. It describes the sun traveling through gates, with 6 gates in the east and 6 in the west, representing different positions on the horizon where the sun rises and sets throughout the year. While the language is ancient and symbolic, it reflects careful observation of real celestial patterns. Ancient skywatchers noticed that the sun's rising and setting points shift over the seasons, moving north and south along the horizon. The text presents a 364-day solar calendar divided into 4 seasons of 91 days each. This system differs from the lunar-based calendar used by many Jewish communities. The calendar appears to have been connected with the Essenes, the Jewish group associated with the preservation of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Grock's analysis identified the connection between the Astronomical Book and the Dead Sea Scrolls community as historically important. Fragments of this section discovered at Qumran, dating to around 200 BCE, show that the material existed before the final compilation of 1st Enoch. This suggests that the Astronomical Book was an independent tradition that was later incorporated into the larger work. The importance of this discovery is that Enoch's astronomical material was not a minor curiosity. It was part of the intellectual and religious world of one of the most influential Jewish communities of the Second Temple period. The text represents an ancient attempt to understand the universe through careful observation, while interpreting those patterns within a worldview that saw the cosmos as ordered and meaningful. The dream visions and the question of prophecy. Chapters 83 through 90 contain 2 major visionary sequences that Grock analyzed with particular attention to a scholarly concept called vaticinium ex eventu, which means prophecy written after the fact. The first vision involves a flood of terrifying scale. The second, and more analytically interesting, is the animal apocalypse, a remarkable allegorical history of the world in which biblical figures and historical nations are represented as different kinds of animals. Adam and Eve appear as white bulls. The people of Israel are depicted as sheep. Their oppressors appear as predators of various kinds. The sequence moves through recognizable events of Israelite history, in an allegorical form. Grock's analysis applied the vaticinium ex eventu framework to identify which portions of the animal apocalypse appear to describe historical events that had already occurred at the time of writing, and which portions appear to project forward into the future from the writer's actual historical position. This is a mainstream scholarly methodology, not a fringe interpretive approach, and its application to the animal apocalypse is well established in academic literature on Second Temple Jewish apocalyptic literature. The future-oriented portions of the dream visions, the sections that appear to project from the writer's position forward rather than describing already completed history, contain material that shares remarkable structural similarities with the Book of Revelation in the New Testament. The sequence of tribulation, divine judgment, destruction of evil, and the renewal of the world appears in both texts in a form specific enough that scholars have long agreed the influence is real. Grock's analysis mapped these structural parallels clearly and noted that the shared sequence is not a general resemblance, but a specific ordering of events that is unlikely to be coincidental. The Son of Man and Why It Matters. The most significant theological discovery in Grock's analysis of the Book of Enoch concerns a figure described in chapters 46 through 48, known as the Son of Man. This figure is presented with extraordinary qualities that distinguish him from ordinary humans and angels. In Enoch, the Son of Man exists before creation, sits beside God on a divine throne, and is appointed to appear at the end of history to judge the wicked and reward the righteous. He is associated with wisdom, righteousness, light, and a unique heavenly status. The title Son of Man is also the name Jesus most often uses for himself in the four Gospels. Across Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the phrase appears many times and is Jesus' primary self-designation. The contexts in which he uses the title often overlap with the characteristics of the Enochic figure. Some Gospel passages connect the Son of Man with a heavenly origin, divine authority, judgment, and the final establishment of God's kingdom. Scholars have debated the relationship between these two traditions for more than a century. One view argues that Jesus intentionally used the Enochic Son of Man concept to communicate a claim about his identity to audiences familiar with Jewish apocalyptic writings. Another view suggests that the connection is broader, meaning that Enochic ideas shaped the cultural understanding of what the title represented, and Jesus drew from that shared background. A third perspective suggests that the Gospel writers themselves shaped their accounts with awareness of the Enochic tradition. The debate is not mainly about whether a connection exists, but about how direct and intentional that connection was. Grock's analysis highlighted a major point. The Book of Enoch provides important historical context for understanding why the title Son of Man carried such powerful meaning in the world of early Christianity. Why the book was not in most Bibles. The question of why the Book of Enoch does not appear in most Western Christian Bibles is more complex than a simple case of removal. Grock's analysis presented a historical explanation involving different religious traditions and decisions about Scripture. The Book of Enoch was never included in the Hebrew Bible canon that developed within Rabbinic Judaism after the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple in 70 CE. During this period, Jewish leaders worked to preserve religious identity and establish a more defined collection of authoritative writings. Texts with complex angelic traditions, such as Enoch's detailed accounts of the Watchers, fallen angels, and heavenly realms, may have been viewed as difficult to integrate into the developing framework of Jewish scripture. The early Christian world had a different relationship with the text. The Book of Enoch was clearly known among early Christians. The letter of Jude directly quotes from it, and other New Testament writings contain themes and ideas that appear connected to Enochic traditions. However, when Christian communities later formalized their biblical canon, the Book of Enoch was not consistently treated as equal in authority to the writings that became part of the standard Western Bible. Its unusual cosmology, extensive angelology, and apocalyptic visions may have contributed to its exclusion from the canon recognized by most churches. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church followed a different historical path. Unlike Western Christianity, it was not shaped by the same Roman and European canon decisions. The Ethiopian tradition preserved the Book of Enoch in the ancient Ge'ez language and has continued to recognize it as scripture. This makes the Ethiopian biblical tradition distinct from most other Christian traditions. Whether Enoch was removed or simply never accepted depends on the perspective. In most Western Christian traditions, it was never part of the official canon. In the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, it has remained part of Scripture for centuries. The difference reflects separate historical developments rather than a single, universal decision. What the Dead Sea Scrolls settled. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered beginning in 1947, there was a position available to skeptics about the Book of Enoch's historical significance. The text existed only in later manuscripts, and some scholars were willing to argue that it was a relatively late composition without deep roots in the Second Temple Jewish world. The Dead Sea Scrolls ended that argument. The excavation at Qumran produced more than 20 fragments of 1st Enoch in Aramaic and Hebrew. These fragments were dated to between 200 and 100 BCE, placing them in the period of the Second Temple, within living memory of the world Jesus grew up in. The number of copies found at Qumran places the Book of Enoch among the most frequently represented texts in the entire collection, present in greater numbers than several canonical Old Testament books. This is archaeology, not interpretation. The physical evidence establishes beyond reasonable dispute that the Book of Enoch was widely known, widely copied, and treated as a significant religious text by the Qumran community during exactly the period when the New Testament world was being formed. The Essenes who preserved the scrolls appear to have had a deep engagement with Enochic material, and the connections between Essene practice and Enochic content, particularly in the calendar and in the angelology, suggest that Enochic texts were not peripheral to their religious life but central to it. The fragments also revealed something that Grock's analysis flagged as important for understanding how the Book of Enoch came together. Different sections of the text appear independently in the Qumran fragments, indicating that the astronomical book and the Book of the Watchers had separate lives as independent texts before being compiled into the larger work. This is consistent with how ancient religious literature typically developed, through the assembly of existing materials rather than single author composition, and it means the traditions the book preserves are likely older than the compilation date suggests. The judgment theology and why it matters. One of the dimensions of the Book of Enoch that Grock's analysis found most significant in terms of its relationship to the New Testament is its theology of judgment and afterlife. The canonical Old Testament is notably underdeveloped on the subject of what happens after death. The concept of Sheol, a shadowy realm of the dead, appears frequently, but the moral differentiation between the righteous and the wicked in the afterlife receives very little attention. The idea of a structured afterlife with different conditions for different categories of people, which is central to the New Testament and especially to the Book of Revelation, does not receive systematic treatment in the Hebrew Bible. The Book of Enoch develops it in considerable detail. The text describes compartments for the dead, different conditions for the righteous and the wicked, a clear structure of divine judgment that determines the fate of individual souls after death, and a final accounting in which the wicked are held responsible and the righteous are vindicated. This is the theological framework that the New Testament assumes as background, and the Book of Enoch is the most developed surviving example of where that framework was elaborated in the period between the Old and New Testaments. The Epistle of Enoch, covering chapters 91 through 108, contains the Apocalypse of Weeks, which divides all of world history into 10 periods, and a series of woes pronounced against the wealthy and powerful who oppress the poor and vulnerable. Grock's analysis noted that the social justice content of the Epistle of Enoch has been specifically compared by scholars to the letter of James in the New Testament and to the woes that Jesus pronounces in the Sermon on the Mount. The concern for accountability of the powerful and protection of the innocent runs through every section of the Book of Enoch, regardless of which period or source it comes from. The cross-cultural parallels. Grock's capacity to map connections across multiple ancient traditions simultaneously produced some of the analysis's most striking comparative observations. The parallels between the Book of Enoch and the mythological traditions of cultures that had no documented contact with ancient Israel are extensive enough to constitute a significant anthropological observation. The flood narrative in Enoch has parallels with the Sumerian flood account in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which predates the biblical account by at least 1,000 years and shares the same core structure. A divine decision to flood the world, a single human warned and saved along with family and animals, a covenant or agreement following the flood's end. The existence of flood narratives across dozens of ancient cultures on every continent has been noted by scholars for generations, and the question of why this particular narrative structure appears so widely is not settled. The Watcher's narrative parallels the Anunnaki tradition in Sumerian and Babylonian religion, divine beings who came from the sky and interacted with humanity. The Nephilim parallel the Titans of Greek mythology, powerful hybrid beings whose overreach required divine intervention and imprisonment. The idea of forbidden knowledge transmitted to humanity by beings who crossed boundaries they should not have crossed appears in Prometheus giving fire to humanity in Greek tradition, in various Hindu traditions about the transmission of divine knowledge to mortals, and in other traditions worldwide. Grock's analysis offered two explanations for these parallels, reflecting the two positions available in serious scholarship. One explanation is cultural diffusion. Ideas traveled between ancient cultures through trade, migration, and conquest, so narrative structures could spread from one tradition to others through contact. The other explanation is independent development. Different human cultures independently developed similar narratives to explain the same universal human experiences, the origin of evil, the experience of forbidden knowledge having consequences, the sense that the world is not as it should be. The AI was explicit that these two explanations do not exhaust the possibilities, but represent the scholarly mainstream, and that mapping the parallels is a legitimate and valuable analytical activity even without settling which explanation is correct. What Grock could not do. The researchers who ran this analysis were careful to be honest about the limits of what the tool could and could not accomplish, and those limits matter for how the results should be understood. Grock is a language model. It identifies patterns, maps connections, and explains material based on its training data. It cannot verify historical claims. It cannot confirm or deny whether supernatural events occurred. It cannot resolve debates that serious scholars have been engaged in for generations. It cannot determine whether the Watchers were literal beings, symbolic figures, or mythological constructions. It cannot establish whether any of the prophecies in the text were genuine foreknowledge rather than vaticinium ex eventu. The AI primarily analyzed English translations of the Book of Enoch, specifically the R.H. Charles translation from 1917, and the more recent Isaac translation from the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha collection. Every translation involves choices that shape the analysis, and working from translations rather than the original Aramaic and Hebrew means that some nuances of the original language are not fully accessible to the analysis. These limitations are real and matter. Treating the output of Grock's analysis as definitive on questions that scholars have debated for over a century would be a misuse of the tool. What the analysis provides is an accessible and organized entry point into scholarship that exists and has been conducted by serious researchers at major universities for generations. That is genuinely valuable. It is not the same as scholarly proof of any particular claim. When asked directly about what it could and could not do, Grok acknowledged these limitations clearly. The appropriate use of the analysis is as a starting point for further investigation, not as a final authority on contested questions. What the scholarship actually says. The Book of Enoch is not ignored by serious academic scholarship. It is the subject of sustained, rigorous professional academic work, conducted by credentialed scholars at major universities. George W. E. Nicholsburg wrote the standard academic commentary on First Enoch for the Hermenia Commentary Series, which is one of the most respected scholarly commentary series in biblical studies. His work represents decades of careful engagement with the text at the highest level of academic rigor. Gabriele Boccaccini at the University of Michigan founded an international scholarly group called the Enoch Seminar, specifically dedicated to studying the Enochic tradition and its influence on early Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism. The academic consensus on the Book of Enoch's influence on early Christianity is not contested at the specialist level. Scholars disagree about the precise degree and direction of that influence, but not about whether it exists. The influence is real, documented, and accepted by the scholars who work most carefully with the relevant texts. The gap that matters is not between what Grok found and what scholars know. Grok's analysis did not discover new information that scholars were unaware of. The gap is between what scholars know and what ordinary people in Western Christian traditions are ever exposed to. The average churchgoer in a Protestant or Catholic tradition has almost certainly never heard of the Book of Enoch, does not know that it is quoted in the New Testament, does not know that it was found extensively at Qumran, and does not know that the Son of Man title that Jesus used repeatedly has a detailed background in this text. That information gap is what Grok's analysis helps close. The Book of Enoch is an ancient, historically significant text preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed its importance, while modern analysis reveals connections to New Testament themes, ancient traditions, and Essene practices. If Enoch was known to Jesus and his disciples, why was it left out of most Bibles? Subscribe and stay with us as we keep asking questions the institutions avoided.